It's a full house. 900 people. It turns out that I gave a talk in Copenhagen. I look back in my old PowerPoints, June 19th, 2005. There were not this many people. Something's happened between then and now. That's 9 years ago. That 900 people would show up on a weekday for a day of inquiry, if you will, about mindfulness. It's not just going to all be a lecture. I mean, I have almost 3 hours with you this morning. I don't want to just talk at you for 3 hours. I'd like us to, in some sense, have the whole thing be an exercise in practice, in inquiry, in deep listening, in touching what it is that brought you here in the first place. So first of all, how many of you can understand me in English, just so I get a sense of like, that's what I thought. I was wondering, why even have a translation? My experience of Scandinavia is that you folks speak better English than we do. So I'm very glad that so many of you actually can understand me in English, and I'm very appreciative for those of you who don't and can't, that we have this translation, and thanks to the translators back there in the little box for doing such a remarkable job of trying to bring something to life and in another language without any rehearsal and in just completely spontaneously. So how many of you would say, just so that I have a sense of who's in the room, how many of you would say that you have a more or less daily meditation practice of some kind or other? And raise your hands. Look around. I mean, this is extraordinary. It's like 90%, 80%, I don't know. It's a huge number of hands. And that in itself is really diagnostic of something. That would not have been true 10 years ago or 20 years ago. There's something happening, and not just in the state of Denmark. There's something happening globally. Yes, if people would shut off their phones, I know the calls, it's very hard to be mindful of disengaging from your devices, okay? That's an advanced meditation practice. They didn't have so many problems with 1,000 years ago or in the time of the Buddha. Tremendously strong attachment to the devices is creating an entirely new level of practice, and the need for practice so that we're not completely enslaved by our devices, so that we're never really present, because we can always be someplace else and find out who's texting us or what's happening on Facebook, or, because this moment might not be interesting enough. And you can see it, people walking down the street. And I like to joke that sooner or later people are going to, have to call themselves up and check, hello, John, are you present? Are you in your body? Are you breathing? And then I'm going to get a bill for it from the telephone company. Whereas you could easily just do it, by checking in. But then you'd have to give up your device. So, and how many of you are brand new to meditation, never practiced, but somehow karmically you wound up in this room? Anybody interested in it? Well, welcome also to you, not too many of you, but you have this very special condition of what the Japanese Zen master Suzuki Roshi called beginner's mind. Don't worry, by the end of the morning you'll have lost it, so you can't hold on to that or anything else. But welcome, and my hope is that by the end of the morning, we'll all have had a chance to really settle into what the essence of this is, because there's really no point in my simply giving a PowerPoint and talking about, as Christina said, why is mindfulness so powerful? You know, it's a great question. I didn't actually call my talk, Why is Mindfulness So Powerful? I called it The Healing Power of Mindfulness and the Mainstreaming of Mbsr in the 35 years that we've been doing this work at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. And I'm going to talk some about the medical, the scientific, the social, cultural. Let me just see if this works. Very low. Okay, but the medical, scientific, social, cultural, and Dharma dimensions. And if you don't know what the word Dharma means, hopefully by the end of today you will. And I'm also really honored to be here with my dear colleague and old-time friend, Saki Santarelli, who, as you heard, has been having trouble getting here, but should be here in a couple of hours. And my wonderful Danish colleagues, Jakob Piet and Lona Frisberg. Did I pronounce that halfway? Say it again. Say it to me. How do you say it? Fjordbak. Thank you. I really, you know, it's an honor to be collaborating with you in doing this work and in having this new Institute for Mindfulness in Denmark that you've started and which you'll hear more about in the afternoon. So I thought that it might be, and I'd also like to just, before we begin, thank the organizers, thank Seminar DK and Christina Jensen, who you just heard, and also the publisher of Full Catastrophe Living in Denmark. Signe Hansen is the editor there, and she's either in the back of the room or out there at the book table. But I'm very appreciative that they have been able to publish the second edition of Full Catastrophe Living, because the first edition was written 25 years ago, and in the past 25 years, was published 25 years ago. In the past 25 years, it's just been a total revolution in the science of mindfulness and in how it's being presented and so forth. And we'll speak some about that. So I thought that what might be best is to just begin by dropping in on ourselves and taking a few moments to just sit in silence. And for those of you who are brand new to it, you'll be happy to know that this is not about performance. You don't have to have some special experience that everybody else is having. Actually, the experience that you're having is very special. After all, you're alive. After all, you're breathing. And after all, it's possible to actually inhabit the present moment with full awareness, to simply be here. Since you came here anyway, why not be fully here? Why not be fully in touch with your body? And what would it take to do that? Not much, actually. Just a strong intention to do that. And so let's just take a few moments before, as the day unfolds, to just drop in and recognize that we've arrived. It took a lot to get here, and here we are. You don't even have to close your eyes. You can if you want to, but the most important thing is to just sit in some kind of posture that embodies wakefulness or dignity. And seeing if you can just allow your breathing to become prominent in the field of your awareness. Of course, you hear me talking, so there's sounds in the room and so forth, but let's just feature the breath center stage in the field of awareness for a moment or two. And any and all sensations that we can be in touch with as the breath comes into the body and as the breath leaves the body. And as best you can, just riding on the waves of the in-breath and the out-breath. And staying as best you can right in this moment for the full duration of the breath coming in and the full duration of the breath leaving the body. And noticing that if you care to, you could expand the field of awareness around your belly or your nostrils or wherever the breath is most prominent in the body, to include a sense of the whole of your body as a whole sitting here breathing. So the feet on the floor, the backs of your legs against the chair, your back perhaps against the back of the chair. A sense of the whole body sitting here breathing. And noticing where the breath sensations are most prominent. And then as best you can, simply resting in this awareness of breathing. It's not the breathing that we're so interested in here. We're just using the breathing as a kind of object of our attention, an object on which we might focus. But the really important element of this gesture is the attending itself, the awareness that arises from paying attention in this way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Which doesn't mean that you won't have judgments or be carried away by thoughts or reactions of one kind or another, but you won't judge the judging. We'll just suspend the judging function for now and just rest in awareness. A capacity that we have always had. It's not something we have to get or manufacture or synthesize or fabricate. Our awareness is a kind of essential and innate capacity of our humanity. And we can learn how to inhabit this domain of being, this form of intelligence, if you will. Take up residency here for a time and just be awake. So you can investigate how much can you just give yourself over to being present without having to have anything have to happen. No special experiences, no agenda, in fact, no next moment, just this one. So in a sense, being in the present moment, giving ourselves over to what we call now, means stepping outside of time. And into what you might call the timeless dimension of being. And where there truly is, as it says in the great Mahayana Heart Sutra, no place to go, nothing to do, and nothing to attain. Why nothing to attain? Because you're already whole. You're already complete. You're already perfect just the way you are, including all your imperfections that the mind is going to object to and come up with as a counter-argument. And all of that is just held in awareness as we rest here moment by moment with the breath center stage in the field of awareness, the breath sensations, but we're not excluding anything. Everything else, thoughts and emotions and sounds in the room and my voice and everything else are just in the wings. For now. And we're, in a sense, befriending the body, befriending silence, befriending wakefulness, and inhabiting the domain of awareness. In other words, we're inviting ourselves to be at home in this moment, in this body, with things exactly as they are. And you may notice as we continue sitting here that the mind has a life of its own. Of course, everybody who has a meditation practice knows that you can ask the mind to focus on one object, like the breath, and it could care less. It will go here, it will go there, it will do whatever it feels like. So there can be all sorts of turbulence and storms in the mind or the body, strong sensations in the back or the knees, or tension in the neck or in the face. And then, of course, there can be impatience coming up, like fatigue, boredom, all sorts of mind states, thoughts moving through the mind, memories of the past is a big favorite, planning for the future, another favorite. It actually turns out there's so much going on, it's very hard to just feel the breath and ride on the waves of the breath. Have you noticed? And so we don't need to take that personally either, but to just expand the field of awareness. And let's see if we can do that now, so that it is, in a sense, able to contain anything that arises. A thought or emotion, a sensation in the body, the breath, memories from the past, planning about the future. And we'll just rest in this very same awareness that was the awareness we touched when we were simply focusing on the breath. So this is actually called many different things in different meditative traditions, but in Mbsr we call it Choiceless Awareness, where we stop choosing what object to pay attention to and become like the sky, just allowing whatever moves in the sky, the sun, the moon, the stars, storms, turbulence, clouds, birds, shadows, light, to just play as it will. And we are the awareness that holds it all, allowing it to come and go and come and go. Since it's the same awareness, we can simply continue resting in awareness and not fighting or struggling with whatever it is that arises. But since the thought stream is so powerful and it's very easy to get pulled into it, and liking and disliking and having opinions are so powerful, it is not a bad idea to come back to the breath every once in a while if you feel totally lost or disoriented, stabilizing your attending once again on this one single object of awareness, the breath, sensations in the body, and then expanding the field of awareness out to a kind of boundless spaciousness whenever, which is the true nature of awareness. You won't find the border or the boundary of your awareness or the center of your awareness. It's boundless spaciousness and also has this property of knowing, non-conceptually. So let's just rest in the silent wakefulness of awareness, resting here in this moment. Again, with nothing, no place to go, nothing to do, and nothing special to feel or to attain or to understand or realize. Just allowing life to be as it is in this moment, that this really is it. This is your life in this moment, as it is. The pleasant, the unpleasant, and the neutral. And we're making space, putting out the welcome mat, if you will, for all of it, and resting here in silence, in stillness, in non-doing. With a light touch and a deep sense of kindness and affection, if you will, for whatever it is that arises. This is an affectionate attending, an open-hearted spaciousness of awareness. Moment by moment, as we sit here. Again, if you're brand new to the meditation practice, it really helps to know that the mind wanders here and there, and that you can always bring it back to your breath, to the breath sensations in the body. And if the mind wanders 100 times, you can always notice what's on your mind each time, just being aware of where your mind has wound up, how it is in the body, and then coming back to the breath over and over and over again. And whether it's the breath or whether it's this vast, open, the spaciousness of awareness, it's still the same awareness. So in a sense, there's no way to get lost as long as you're willing to simply drop in and open to your experience. Now noticing as you heard the sound of the bells and began to shift and so forth, that we can keep the awareness. You can reside in the awareness. There's no necessary end to the meditation practice. You're still in your body, you're still breathing. Thoughts are still moving through the mind. You still have whatever emotions are here in the present moment. Excuse me. So, why don't you take a moment and just look around? Let's just drink in each other as part of the field of awareness. Whoops. So noticing how you feel now. This whole invitation to drop in isn't about feeling better. It's about feeling and being in touch with life unfolding. So there are a lot of ways in which we can kind of misunderstand meditation as about sort of self-improvement. It's got nothing to do with self-improvement. It has to do with freedom. It has to do with liberation. It has to do with recognizing the full dimensionality of our humanity. And the meditation practice isn't just sitting. Okay, we did it sitting, but we can do it in many different ways. We can practice in many different ways. And I like to think that when I do take my seat in the morning to sit, that just doing this, just taking your seat in one way or another, and it doesn't have to be on a cushion. It could be on a chair, or it could be lying down, or it could be standing, or it could be hanging upside down for that matter. But whatever position you park your body in, so to speak, that this is a radical act to simply make space in your day for a formal period of being, of dropping in on yourself, so to speak. And I've come to feel over the past more than 45 years that I've been practicing that this is a kind of very radical act to do this, especially in such a busy society, busy world. To actually stop and drop into being is a radical act of sanity and a radical act ultimately of love. It's not a radical act of narcissism. Okay, this is not about navel contemplation or self-promotion or pretending you're somebody you're not. It's about being who you already are in all of your beauty, and also putting out the welcome mat for what's hard, what's difficult, what's easy to turn away from, what's unwanted. Does anybody have anything going on in your life that's hard, difficult, easy to turn away from, and unwanted? If so, raise your hands just so I can get a sense of, you know. Yeah, and it's not like, oh, I'd be a great meditator if only nothing was happening and I could be calm and happy, like maybe on vacation. But even if you go on vacation, it rains and, you know, you don't like the food, or the hotel's no good, or whatever it is, or something breaks, and or the unexpected comes up. So mindfulness is really about taking in what we call in English the full catastrophe of the human condition, the entirety of the human condition, and holding it in awareness. And when we do hold it in awareness, it is transformative and healing. And my working definition of healing is that it's coming to terms with things as they are. In other words, it's not trying to avoid what's the pain and the suffering, but to actually put the welcome mat out for it and understand that we can always modulate how we are in relationship to it. Because it's part of the human condition. It cannot be escaped from, but we can have the freedom to be in much wiser and more self-compassionate relationship to it. And when we do that, that is healing. That is transformative. And in a sense, that is where the love comes from. You know, that we can find our way to love and accept and include people who ordinarily we would just have aversion to, or circumstances where we would just have aversion to, or stressful conditions where we would just lose our minds. The first thing we do is lose our minds. Well, how helpful is that when we need to actually deal with life? So this is like, mindfulness is like cultivating a muscle. It's like exercising a muscle. And of course, the resistance that you use, if you have a weight, you know, we need the weight to have a certain, supply a certain resistance so that the muscle can grow. And in the same way, we could look at the full catastrophe of life as just that, you know, an opportunity for us to exercise that muscle, the muscle of clarity, the muscle of wisdom, the muscle of self-compassion, the muscle of other compassion, the muscle of kindness. And these are all woven into mindfulness, as I'll show you as we move through a little of the PowerPoint. But the important thing is not that, you know, the talk go into your head, but that the talk go into your heart, or that my heart meet your heart, and that something emerge that speaks to why you came to hear me and the other presenters today in the first place. Nobody's here by accident. You don't wind up in the Bella Center here in Copenhagen by accident. So you might want to reflect for a moment about what really brought you here. Maybe it's ambition. Maybe you want to teach this stuff because it's so popular nowadays and you can make money at it, and you know, all sorts of things like that might be part of the motivation. It'd be good to be aware of that, because that can get you into huge trouble. This is the work of a lifetime. You cannot learn this and teach it in, you know, by taking a weekend workshop or a seminar. It's a lifetime's work. And it's very deep. It's one of the mindfulness, to answer why is it so powerful. It's powerful because it comes out of some of the deepest traditions of inquiry and introspection that the human culture has produced in the past, 2,000 or 3,000 years. I did not make up mindfulness in 1979. It's often spoken of, as you'll see, as the heart of Buddhist meditation. It was a sort of a really refined articulation of dimensions of our human capacity that have to do with liberation from ignorance, from greed, from hatred, from delusion, from mind states and body states that imprison us. And therefore, it's about freedom. And a lot of the suffering that we create ourselves. It's bad enough that sometimes things happen and we really have to deal with the unexpected, the accidental, earthquakes, typhoons, catastrophes of all kinds. But then we create far more suffering in our not wanting it, in our reactions against it, out of our ignorance or out of our desire, our greed for it to be another way. And these are muscles that we can exercise. We can exercise the muscle of not believing in our own storyline about what we need to be happy, for instance. But actually seeing, in a certain sense, realizing that if you can't be happy now, it's very unlikely that 20 more years of anything are going to make you more happy. They might make you 20 years older, but not necessarily happier or more integrated as a human being. So this is the work of no time. They say in the Buddhist tradition that, it's not about, there's this famous story that a girl came home and said, when I'm a Buddhist, it drives my parents crazy. But when I'm a Buddha, nobody has any problem with it at all. So this is not about being a Buddhist, even though it comes from the essence of the Buddhist tradition. And in fact, the Buddha was not a Buddhist. This is about being human. And it's about deep discoveries that, if we make use of them, can actually transform our lives and our health and our well-being, and I would say, our world. And I don't know if you've noticed it, but the world is in sorry need of some degree of wisdom. And I really believe that mindfulness writ large has the potential, if it's brought into government, if it's brought into economics, if it's brought into banking, with all of the ethical foundations that are associated with it, can transform the planet. And we need to transform the planet, because you could think of our species as the autoimmune disease of the planet. We are giving the planet a fever. Okay? We are acidifying the oceans at catastrophically rapid levels that the natural homeostatic processes of the earth can deal with, but they will deal with them by, melting the polar ice caps and all the glaciers, and by the dying of all the coral reefs and other ecological, environments, and raising the temperature, the ambient temperature of the planet in ways that will not be so wonderful for human beings, for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. So maybe we do need to wake up and come to our senses as a species, because we call our species Homo sapiens sapiens, right? The species that in Latin, from the verb sapere, which means to taste or to know, we're the species that knows, and we're the species that knows that it knows. Awareness and meta-awareness, you could say. Well, that's great. I think it's time for us to live into it. And so I'm very optimistic about the potential for this work to move more into the world in many, many different ways. In education, in hospitals, in government, in economics, in all sorts of different fields, because the final common pathway of what makes us human is our capacity for empathy and awareness. And if we can't live that and act in that kind of a way, then as a species, we're going to be in serious trouble, because not only are we the automatic, by being the autoimmune disease of the planet, if you will, not only are we the vector of all of this dysregulation, but we're the first victim, we ourselves. Okay? So, the way I thought we'd do this is that I'll just talk, and we'll just all be together. And I'm not going to take any breaks. At least I hope I'm not going to take any breaks. I don't know what I will do if I have to go to the bathroom. But if you have to go to the bathroom, just go, okay? But I'm not going to take any breaks, because it will take far too long. There aren't enough bathrooms. So would that be okay with you, that we'll just go until noon? And maybe I'll do this sitting, or we'll start this way. So are you okay? Yeah. And for those of you who are being translated, you don't have to get everything. I mean, it's like even with the slides, I won't cover all the slides, and we'll just see how far we get. And how many of you have trained in Mbsr, are either an Mbsr teacher or are training to become an Mbsr teacher? Let me see your hands. Whoa, that's extraordinary. I mean, that's at least 100 people in the room. I'm very touched to hear that. And what about mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT? That might be even okay. And wonderful. And I know my friend Antonio Sumbundu is a big vector in Denmark in that way. How many of you know Antonio? Okay, well, wonderful. Please say hi to her. I hear she's traveling, so just not going to see her this trip. But again, this is about the deepest capacities of being human. So while it's easy to think that, especially if you're trained as a psychologist, that this is just one more cognitive behavioral type of intervention that you can learn out of a book, you're way off. You cannot learn it out of a book. As I said, you can't learn it in a couple of weekend seminars. This is something that really is a lifetime's undertaking, and it's really good to train in effective programs that have strong track records, and there are many of those around the world in a growing number. And my colleague Saki Santarelli will talk about the training of Mbsr teachers this afternoon. So I'm going to say a little just about the origins of Mbsr. The idea back in 1979 was to catch people falling through the cracks of the healthcare system. My deepest aim, having been practicing the meditation for years, by 1979, I was practicing for 13 years, okay? And it became very important to me as a young man, very important to me. I wanted my work and my meditation practice to be the same thing. I was trained in molecular biology at MIT in the laboratory of Salvador Luria, a Nobel laureate. And so I got a very, very heavy dose of mainstream science. And in those days, in the 60s, the idea of studying the mind, there was no such thing as neuroscience at that point. I mean, it was very difficult. We didn't even have the technology to study the mind. Since then, there's been a revolution in science that's allowed us to do many things that we were not able to do before. So I wanted to bring mindfulness into the mainstream of society, and I thought, what better place to do it than in a hospital? Because people go there when they're suffering, you know. There are some, I'll show you a slide that says the hospitals function like dukkha magnets in our society. Nobody wants to go to the hospital unless they're suffering to a very large extent. So what better place to offer them training in this essential wisdom practice that could have some kind of liberate effect in terms of their suffering. So the idea was to create a clinic in the form of a course that would catch people falling through the cracks of the healthcare system and offer them something that they could do for themselves as a complement to whatever their doctors and medicine could do for them. And then just see what happened. You know, it was an experiment. And it would be based on intensive training in Buddhist meditation and mindful hatha yoga. Because those were things that had touched me very deeply and that I loved and felt like, well, this is what I want to do, so I knew that. So could I have put in Tai Chi? Sure. But, or Qigong or something like that. There are many different kinds of practices. But it's very important when you're developing some kind of health intervention that you not throw in all sorts of different things, because then you confuse people. So there's something about keeping it simple and not throwing in everything you want to put in there that's very important, because we need to leave a lot of space. After all, awareness is about space. It's not about filling things up so that you can know them. And so from the very beginning, this is why mindfulness is so powerful. It is this wisdom dharma that's come out of the Buddhist tradition but is universal. So it's not about becoming a Buddhist. It's about recognizing that you are already a Buddha in the sense of what people mean by Buddha. That means a fully developed being that has the potential for waking up. And it's not, as I said, a standard cognitive behavioral paradigm or method. It's not a therapy. It's a universal Dharma perspective grounded in practice. And in 1979, when I, thought to do this, the question would be, would medical patients even be interested, and would doctors be willing to refer people to such a strange clinic? And what would we call it? So I thought that it would be good to call it stress reduction clinic, because everybody can relate to stress reduction. Everybody is stressed, everybody knows what it is. And that was in 1979. If you think back to 1979, if you were alive in 1979, and you think 1979, what stress compared to now? We have so much more stress now. And stress, it turns out, the first noble truth in the Buddhist tradition is the truth of suffering. It's often translated as dukkha. Now people translate dukkha, some Buddhist scholars, as stress. So there was a nice confluence there. And back in 1979, there was no really strong scientific evidence that stress influenced health or lifespan or anything like that. In 2004, Elizabeth Blackburn, who won the Nobel Prize a few years later for the discovery of telomerase and how it works, telomeres, this enzyme that works on telomeres, which are the repeat subunits of DNA at the ends of all of our chromosomes, it turns out that stress degrades them. And when you reach a certain point, there's no more telomere left on your chromosomes, then the cells go into senescence. They basically die. So this is a molecular model of aging and how stress accelerates the aging process. But it's not the stress that's the key thing, because if it turns out that it's how you are in relationship to the stress. If you have a wise relationship to the stress, if you can modulate even very intensive levels of stress because you've expanded your awareness and your capacity to be with the unwanted, then your chromosomes, the telomeres, don't degrade that fast. And there are all sorts of studies now by coming out of this group, and Alyssa Epple in particular, showing that mental factors, such as anxiety, and can generate degradation of the telomeres. Your telomeres decrease in length. So another thing we didn't know in 1979 was that stress degrades the brain function, and even structure in a number of different ways. So the prefrontal cortex, this region right behind the forehead, which is involved in what's called executive functioning and working memory, so that we can keep in mind what we need to keep in mind to make conscious decisions and smart decisions and so forth. When you get stressed, the first thing that goes is you lose your mind. You lose the clarity of the prefrontal cortex. And that is, we've all had that experience. The hippocampus and the amygdala are part of this, what's called the limbic system. And the hippocampus is one of the major regions in the brain that's involved in learning and memory. And stress degrades the hippocampus. It actually gets smaller. And for the amygdala, which is the threat and alarm centers in the brain, they get bigger with stress. Okay, so this was not known in 1979. Now there's a real science of this, and it's part of a field called neuroplasticity, where it's understood that the brain is an organ that's continually changing itself based on experience. And in traumatic experiences can actually degrade brain function, and experiences of kind of repetitive work like meditation, which is very repetitive, can actually drive changes in the brain. And I'll show you some of those in a minute. Another field that didn't exist in 1979 is called epigenetics. That is, that it used to be thought that whatever chromosomes you're born with, whatever genes you're born with, that's your genetic fate. But it turns out that all sorts of things can actually influence which genes are turned on and which genes are turned off on our chromosomes. And that means that we can actually regulate our health and well-being by how we eat, how much sleep we get, the kinds of relationships we have with other people. All of these things actually influence your biology. This was completely unknown in that time. And in particular, I mean, this is a study that's come out of MIT, the Center for Neuroscience at MIT, Picower Center, an epigenetic marker that keeps chromatin tight, that's the protein around the DNA, tightly wound and represses gene expression, responds to stress by silencing a large number of genes necessary for memory foundation, leading to impaired cognitive function. In other words, these kinds of changes may actually be involved in Alzheimer's, in early dementia, all sorts of things. And the suggestion with this field is that we can make conscious lifestyle changes that can actually move us in the direction of greater well-being, greater health at a biological level. So when we talk about Mbsr, there are a number of formal meditation practices that we use. First, you may have heard that the first meditation we do in Mbsr is usually eating 2 raisins, and it takes a long time. So why do we do that even? Well, it's to disabuse people of the notion that meditation is just some kind of thing like this, where you're imitating a statue in the British Museum. Eat 2 raisins, what's meditative about that? Well, it's the same awareness. Can you actually taste them? And a lot of the time we don't taste our food. We're too busy up here or talking or whatever. So can you actually taste 1 raisin? Again, paying attention. People report, you've all had the experience probably, a sense that maybe you've never tasted a raisin before in your life. Because when you pay attention to it, experience lights up. So there are 4 classical meditative postures in, in the traditions. One of them is lying down meditation, but very few people nowadays in the various meditative traditions practice lying down meditation. But it's very powerful, especially when you have people with chronic pain conditions. They ask them to sit on the floor like that for 45 minutes and no one would come back for the second class. But if you have people take off their shoes and lie down on the floor in the hospital, well, who takes off their shoes and lies down on the floor in the hospital? It's like a new adventure. And you can be comfortable lying on the floor, and if not on your back, then some other way. And so this is, the body scan, this lying down meditation that we visit various parts of the body with full awareness. And it's almost like we're reclaiming the body. And I don't know about Denmark, but in the United States, people have all sorts of stuff about their bodies, Very few people really feel completely good about their bodies. It's like too old, too young, too this, too that. It's never good enough, And so here, this is a kind of exercising that muscle of maybe it is good enough for now. Just this moment, could it be good enough? Just this moment, like can I be okay with my body without, oh, it's too this or too that? Because actually the body is like just an amazing miracle of, just imagine for a moment what your liver does. You couldn't do that. What your heart does, what your brain does. I mean, it's like, it's like we're all walking miracles and then we get depressed because something's not going our way. It's like, wait a minute, that's like, have a little perspective here. And we're always thinking, oh, it'll be better later, on the weekend, or, we live for some other moment. But we've been doing that our whole lives. This is it. This is the other moment. This is the moment of all the previous moments in your life. And if you've been scheming and planning like, oh, when this happens and when that happens, when it all comes together, this is the moment that it's all together. There's no other moment. And if you think that another 20 or 30 years of scheming that when I get divorced or when I get married or when the children leave the house or when whatever, when I'm, make more money, always about the future, and it's always here, now. So that is a way of imprisoning ourselves, seriously. And you can begin to experience that in any of these meditative practices. So the body scan, and sometimes when our room is very crowded, we have people put their feet up like that, or if they have back problems. By the way, this fellow here is George Mumford, who went on to train the Chicago Bulls and the Los Angeles Lakers in mindfulness during all their championship seasons. So Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant all practiced this. And they're very wealthy, and they're also very tall, and they're very good basketball players, but they still do this. Why? Because they feel that the more present they are, the more they have a kind of awareness of what's going on the basketball court, the more effective they can be. And even if it's a tiny little bit more effective, well, that's how you win basketball games. And of course, the coach was deeply into it, and that's how this came about. So here's sitting meditation. And we do this, in Spanish with minority populations, and we're demonstrating, this is universal. You don't have to be white, you don't have to be middle class, it's basically for human beings if it's taught in an effective, correct way. And there are a lot of ways to teach it so that it's just not effective. And mindful hatha yoga. So I thought I would just show you a 3-minute clip of a video that it's a 45-minute program, which is available, by the way, on the web now. If you go to my website, jonkabat-zinn.com, spelled with the hyphen, you can watch the whole 45 minutes. It's part of a public television series that was made 20 years ago by a fellow named Bill Moyers, a very famous journalist who used to be in the White House press secretary, who made a 5-part sequence called Healing in the Mind. And he came and featured our clinic in 1992. So you're going to see me magically become 20 years younger. Okay. And let's just see if we can get this to work.
I tried to do it after I was doing my stretches for rehab, thinking that that's what I needed to relax. And all I felt was a real heightened awareness of all the pain. I felt really angry at all the pain and all the trouble that it's caused.
So there's a lot of anger there.
Yeah.
Do you feel at all friendly towards your body?
I feel like I've always used my mind to overcome it. And now I can't do that anymore.
Well, this is an experiment in learning how to do the whole thing differently. And the first thing is that if pain is there, we're not going to wall it off and deny that it's present, okay? It's going to be here, and we have to, in some way, learn how to work around the corners of it, work with it, and still not have it erode the quality of our life.
He takes the people we can't help. Those are the ones who get to Jon.
Can you bend your knees? Can you go flat? That's it. Okay. Beautiful. You got it. Take your hands away then. No need the hand. By the third week, I like to get them down on the floor practicing yoga. Especially the people who feel their bodies don't work very well anymore. Because often what comes up for them is quite painful. That's fine. And you feel the pain. And you just see, let me see if I can ride the waves of the sensation. And you watch the sensations come and go, and very often they will change. Noticing that you can uncouple the sensations from your thoughts about them. Like, this is killing me, it's going to last forever, there's nothing I'll be able to do about it. You learn to free yourself from those thoughts and realize those are just thoughts. And then it turns out there's inner stillness and peace right within some of the most difficult life situations.
People this week asked my wife, "Hey, what's with Danny?" Your friends started to ask your wife? Yeah, well, they didn't say it to me. Well, no, it wasn't my friend, it was my mother-in-law. Boy, he's awful nice and talkative all of a sudden now. I started laughing. I thought it was pretty good. I didn't notice that. I said, "Oh, there's nothing with me."
So this 3-minute sequence was made by my colleague Paul Grossman, who was going to a conference in Germany on meditation, and apparently a lot of people nowadays want to differentiate mindfulness from compassion. So like, oh, they do mindfulness, but they don't do compassion. So he picked out these 3 minutes just to kind of make the argument that maybe there's a little bit of compassion in the mindfulness. But if you're, if this resonated with you in any way, this is available now to just watch on the web. And you go through the whole sequence, if you will, of the 8 weeks in 45 minutes. So let's just sort of get down to basics and ask, well, what is mindfulness anyway? And I did say a little of this. It's the heart of Buddhist meditation, and it is fundamentally what we call a liberative practice. And it has to be understood this way. Again, it's not a cognitive behavioral intervention. It's entirely orthogonal to it. It's a different way of understanding the mind and reality, really. Liberation from what? Well, how about fear, delusion, ill will, suffering? By recognizing them in ourselves. And the misapprehension of reality and the nature of the self. So we're always creating a sense of self. And very often, that becomes imprisoning for us too, because it's really a story, a narrative. Who we are is like a big story, but maybe that's the tiny littlest bit of who we actually are. And so this is an opportunity to actually see into how much we imprison ourselves, and then in cultivating wisdom, discernment, balance of mind and heart, which you could call emotional intelligence, compassion, and kindness. And they all flow out of the cultivation of mindfulness. William James is famous for having said, he's the father of American psychology, famous for having said, the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compass sui, which I think means more or less in his right mind, if he have it not. An education which should produce this faculty would be the education par excellence, but it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical instructions for bringing it about. Now, he said that in 1890, sitting in his office in Harvard University. If you drilled through the center of the earth and came out the other side, you'd be in China, where they've been practicing just this for thousands of years in the monasteries. The mind wanders, you recognize where your mind is, and you bring it back. We were just doing it before. But he had no idea about that. Why? Because no internet. So what they were doing in China, you wouldn't necessarily get. You wouldn't know that they've been doing that for thousands of years, or in Korea, or in Japan, and that this had been developed into a precise art with many different schools and ways of understanding it, based on these profound understandings that have been, written down in the Buddhist tradition and passed on in various cultures in different streams for hundreds and thousands of years, from one student to teacher to teacher to teacher to teacher. Everybody starting out as a student, and then eventually the good ones becoming teachers, and then moving on. But it's, it's a lineage. It's a lineage. It's not something that you just kind of call it mindfulness and make up whatever you like. It's a profound discovery of the human culture over thousands of years. And William James is talking about this as the education par excellence. Well, now in the United States, mindfulness is being brought into elementary and secondary education. That is, elementary school, primary school, and secondary school, high school, because the teachers are completely desperate. They can't teach anymore because the kids aren't ready to learn. They don't know how to pay attention even. They don't know how to be in their bodies. And so the teachers are actually bringing mindfulness into the classroom, and more books are being written about it by really competent teachers. And it's just a very uplifting movement. So it started out in hospitals, but now it's spreading to the legal profession. It's spreading to sports, as I said. It's spreading to education. It's even moving into government. I'll show that. So Sigmund Freud was famous for having said, describing how the analyst, the psychoanalyst, should keep his or her mind, although I think it was almost all his in that day, mind during a stream of consciousness. And he described it as an even hovering attention or evenly suspended attention. In other words, as you're listening to your patient who is offering stream of consciousness, just talking about whatever they're talking about, that you're not getting caught in the story. You're not getting caught in your own mind, judging. You're just listening with even hovering attention. Well, that's a great working definition of mindfulness. And then Carl Jung, who, as you know, went way beyond Freud in his interest in the sort of deep structure of the human mind and the, sort of archetypal dimensions of human psychology. Talking about Zen, he said the methods and philosophical doctrines that have been developed in the East have simply put all Western attempts along these lines into the shade. And that was back in the 1950s when he wrote this for D.T. Suzuki's book, Introduction to Zen Buddhism, and he wrote the foreword to that book. Now, if Jung were to come back now, he would be astonished. He's 900 people in Copenhagen coming to a day-long symposium on mindfulness. Inconceivable in 1950. He said, I don't have the slide, but he said, this is not something the Western mind could get. Now, why are all the Asian teachers teaching in the West? Because the Western mind can't get it? I don't think so. I think it's because the Western mind is prepared for it, is hungry for it, has a deeper understanding of its potential value than even, Asian cultures at the moment. So that means that we're in a beautiful position to actually take this precious inheritance, this precious jewel of Dharma, and actually let it move through us and shape us in ways that would be potentially healing and transformative at a level of an individual, at the level of a family, at the level of a school, at the level of a school system, at the level of local government, at the level of, national government, and at the level of, the planet. And God knows we need it. We need something. This may just be it, because it's not like find some new leader that will put all our trust in. No, it's like this is a distributive function. We're all part of this. We're the cells of the human body of the earth. And if we have this capacity for healing and transformation and we don't make use of it, then that is what sadder and more profound manifestation of ignorance could there possibly be? So when I'm giving medical grand rounds, which I used to do a lot, everywhere in the United States, in Canada, and more recently in other countries, I don't do it so much anymore, but when I go and give grand rounds to doctors, I always show this slide because, I want people to understand that I didn't make up mindfulness, that it comes out of some very, very deep and powerful tradition that is not about Buddhism, it's not about religion, it's not about divinity. People used to go up to the Buddha. By the way, this is the Buddha that is in the Kamakura, Japan, if any of you have been there. This Buddha is as big as a house. I mean, it's gigantic, very impressive. And people used to go up to the Buddha, apparently, and say, "Are you a god?" Because he had this kind of presence. How many of you have been in the presence of the Dalai Lama? Anybody? Yeah. Many people, he walks into the room. It happened with my daughter. I took him to a giant, meeting that the Dalai Lama came to. She started crying. She was only like 8 years old. She started crying when he walked into the room. A lot of people feel something when they are in his presence. And so they naturally, the Buddha that would ask him, "Are you a god?" And he said, "No, I'm awake." This is important, folks. If you remember nothing else, this is the most important point. I'm awake. It's possible. Don't project onto me that I'm some kind of divine being, okay? I'm a human being that has, in some sense, experimented in the laboratory of his own life to try to drill down to what is the full dimensionality of my humanity, and it is wakefulness, and not separate from compassion. Embodied wakefulness is compassion, because you immediately understand, see, feel that we're not separate from each other. So then your suffering, I am immediately impelled to move towards you, to act. I don't have to think, oh, how should I relate to this woman, and what shall I get in return? What will I get back? Because it's not about me. There's no separation between me and you. That is an expression of our true humanity. And we see it all the time. I mean, you don't have, this happens a lot in society, but it never gets to the newspapers. Only the bad news gets to the newspapers, not the generosity, the kindness, the compassion. So what is the opposite of awake? Well, it's kind of on autopilot. The way we live our lives, you're kind of zoning along on autopilot, and we're kind of awake, but we're more or less half awake, half asleep, in a kind of dream state, and lost in thought, we say in English a lot. Do you say that in Danish too? I'm lost in thought? Yeah. Well, underline the lost part, because when you're lost, you're not present. And all you have to do is be aware of that, and the next moment you're here. And when you're here, you can act differently from when you're not here, because you don't have all your faculties. And I'll show you that some of the brain regions that are affected by Mbsr training are just those faculties that you need for things like perception taking and emotion regulation under stress. Just those times when you most need to be yourself and you lose it because you get overwhelmed by the stress, that's where the rubber meets the road, as we say in English, where the application of mindfulness in that moment could be tremendously powerful. Revolutionary, really. And the consequence of living your life on automatic pilot is that you may never be where you actually are. You're always someplace else. You're always on the way to some better moment. This moment's not good enough, I won't be here for it. I'm happy to be present as long as you can guarantee that I'll be happy. So I wrote a book once called Wherever You Go, There You Are. Okay? But I could have equally called it Wherever You Go, There You're Not. For this reason. Okay? That if we're not paying attention, if we're not cultivating awareness, then we can very easily just flip into automaticity. Seeing people without seeing them. Hearing them without hearing them. Even people we love, even in our families. Has anyone ever told you, in your family, you never listen to me? That happens in Denmark too. Oh. You never listen to me. When they say that, listen to them, because it's true. You know, we are very selective in how we pay attention, and mostly what we pay attention to, if you start to pay attention to how you pay attention, is things that have to do with me. Why? Because what's more important than me? So if you're talking about me, even in a whisper over there, I know you're talking about me, I can hear it. But if you're talking to me about something I don't want to hear, about how the car needs to be repaired, well, I'm too busy. We're very, very selective. And so we get caught constantly in these prisons of our own creation. And then, of course, we don't blame ourselves. We want to blame everybody else for it. So once we know this, we can actually do something about it. In the Mahasatipatthana Sutra, the great sutra on mindfulness, the Buddha is famous for having said, this is the direct path for the purification of beings. Okay? For the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation. Lamentation means great sorrow. For the disappearance of pain and grief. for the attainment of the true way, in other words, living an authentic life, for the realization of liberation from our own delusion and ignorance and greed and hatred or aversion, namely the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Okay? Another teaching of his. And the four foundations, the first foundation is the body. So we pay a lot of attention to the body. When John Teasdale and Mark Williams and Zindel Siegel, the cognitive therapists who went on to create mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, when they first came to visit us at UMass in the medical school and they visited my class, they were kind of dumbfounded. They came out of the class saying, my God, they pay attention to the body. It was like a discovery. They pay attention to the body. I said, well, why not? Well, we're cognitive therapists. Cognitive therapists. So you can feel the duality, the dualism. Okay, we pay attention to thoughts, but we don't pay attention to the body. But how do thoughts and emotions manifest? They manifest in the body. If we're not paying attention to the body, it's like cutting off one of your legs and then trying to run a race. So cognitive therapy is actually being transformed by this discovery that's not really a discovery, that, we have bodies. So maybe the cognition needs to be understood in a much bigger way. So if the Buddha's not kidding, if this is really true, the direct path for purifications of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the realization of liberation, if this is true actually, then maybe we should actually understand what this is, study it, immerse ourselves in it, and in the practice, in the cultivation, and let whatever we do, whether we're therapists, whether we're physical therapists, whether we're teachers, come out of that, and not out of some kind of, sort of superficial weekend workshop about relaxation or mindfulness or something like that. It would be a crime to abandon this powerful essence because we think we understand it when we don't. And none of us really understand it, I want to say. It's not like I understand it. It's a lifetime's work. And it's valuable to study with people who have walked this path. And there are many great Dharma teachers in Scandinavia, in Denmark, in the UK. I mean, there are plenty of people to study with. And that's what Mbsr teachers are doing, is they're actually drinking from this well, so to speak, and then offering it in a much more mainstream way to the world. But it's got to be the essence of Dharma, or it's not mindfulness. Mindfulness is the essence of Dharma. Okay? Now, that's an arguable point because different Buddhist scholars have different views of what mindfulness even is, and different interpretations of the basic texts and so forth. But scholars are always talking about those kinds of things and arguing about that kind of differentiation. But so sometimes they don't like my definition of mindfulness and they think it's to this or to that. But my definition is only meant to be operational. It's meant to be a skillful means to get humanity going in this direction, and then let the Buddhist scholars and everybody else contribute to our deepening understanding over the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. Okay? Because we're all on the same planet together, so it's not like, we need to be involved in making each other wrong. It's like much more important to learn from each other. Now, I take it that it's true in Danish as well, that the words meditation and medicine sound a lot alike. Is that correct? And that's because they come from the same root meaning. So the idea that we're teaching meditation in a medical school, well, 35 years ago when I started this, you could have thought that it was tantamount to the Visigoths are at the gates of Western civilization, about to tear down the citadel of civilization, bringing meditation into medicine. But they are linked. in some very deep way, which I write about in For Catastrophe Living. I'm not going to go into it at the moment. Now, here's the Chinese word for mindfulness, which is made up of two characters, the character for presence or now over the character for heart. I love that. And in all Asian languages, they tell me the word for mind and the word for heart, same word. So in English, if you're not hearing the word heartfulness when you're hearing the word mindfulness, you're not understanding it. And that's what Paul was trying to show in that 3-minute video. That this is not all some kind of clinical mindfulness, without heart. It's all based on interconnection and the recognition of our common humanity. And that's felt here. It's not something that's merely intellectual. And when that's embodied, that makes a huge difference. So my working definition of mindfulness is it's, moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness is one way to put it, and cultivated by paying attention. So paying attention is a big part of it, but it's not just paying attention, as you'll see. So this is my present working definition of mindfulness. Here's another, if you only remember this, it's good. Mindfulness is awareness. Okay? It's not some special thing, it's awareness. The special thing is awareness. And you already have it. That's why I said in the guided meditation, you don't need to get anything. We usually think, oh, I'm meditating. I have to do something special and feel something special, or it won't be a good meditation. That's totally wrong. What's special is that you can do this at all. That you can take your seat, metaphorically or literally, and drop in and open to what's present. In other words, rest in awareness. We can do that. Raise your hands if you didn't have any trouble doing that during the guided meditation, that you actually understood what I said and meant and was pointing to when I said rest in awareness. Were you able to rest in awareness even for a brief moment? Raise your hands if you were. Raise your hands up high so I can feel them. That's everybody, pretty much. That's important data. That's data. That's telling you this is not some special thing that, only a few of us can do. But how much of the time do we do it? Never. How about never? Why? Because we're always busy. Doing. To get. So when the meditation instructions say there's no place to go, there's nothing to do, and there's nothing to get, that's important. You don't have to even understand it. Just give yourself a break. Don't understand it. Just don't rush after so many things. And then gradually what happens is that you come to befriend yourself. This moment becomes okay, as it is. The good, the bad, and the ugly. It doesn't mean you don't respond to the bad or the ugly. It doesn't mean you don't help people. It doesn't mean you walk away from society and live in a cave and don't care about human beings. It doesn't mean any of that stuff. It means you act appropriately out of being, and you let your doing come out of being. That's a yoga. That's a worthy yoga. You let the doing come out of being. So mindfulness is awareness, the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. Now sometimes it's not on purpose. After you've been practicing for a very long time, it becomes spontaneous. It's like what's called effortless mindfulness. You don't have to make an effort. You don't have to say, now I'm going to be mindful. It's just like you are. So it can become like that natural state, the normative state, the default mode of living. And when we get to talk about the default mode, which I hope I get to talk about soon in the brain, what mindfulness training is in some way is changing the default mode from one of mindlessness and self-absorption and self-centeredness to one of mindfulness, heartfulness and a much larger field in which you're not the center of the universe. Or if you are the center of the universe, at least you have the awareness that so is everybody else. And not the center of your universe, the center of their universe. And that's a very healthy way to say. And you could say, well, what's the point? What is the point? This is another place where people criticize me. They don't like this definition because they feel like it doesn't say what the point is. And I never felt like it was important to say what the point was, because let people discover the point for themselves rather than giving them a point, and then they say, oh, that's why I'm meditating, to get someplace else. But why would we be doing this? We'd do it in the service of liberation, compassion, and wisdom. Some people think, oh, we just do it to make people feel better, to just reduce their symptoms, and that Mbsr is like, you know, it's just about making people feel better, but not enlightening them. I don't think you can separate the two, because one thing is you realize, you begin to see how much you make yourself not feel good, and then when you see that, that's an enlightening moment. That's a realization. That's a kind of direct perceiving that there's some way that you are harming yourself and you can not do that. That's freedom right there. So this is kind of really a non-dual practice, and we don't need to say that. So it involves attention and intention, and I spoke a lot about, you know, attention to what. And there are two ways to think about meditation. One is like everything else. You take a class, you do what they say to do, you follow the instructions. I call that scaffolding. In other words, to build a building, you have to, or to paint the ceiling like the Sistine Chapel, you have to have scaffolding, and then Leonardo and his assistants get up on the ceiling and they paint, okay? But when they finished with the Sistine Chapel ceiling, they take the scaffolding down. The scaffolding is not essential, except to do the work. That's one form, that's one aspect of meditation. The other aspect is that it's non-instrumental. Just as I said in the guided meditation, there's no place to go, nothing to do, nothing to attain. So it's not, yes, if you practice, you'll get better. Things will deepen. And at the same time, if you practice, things can't get better because you're already whole. And you have to hold both of those the same way as the electron in quantum mechanics, that we know that elementary particles, say an electron, it's not a particle and it's not a wave. It depends on how you look at it. If you look at it through one set of lenses, it acts like a wave. If you look at it through another set of lenses, it acts like a particle. So we don't have language for that. So in the same way, meditation, we don't really have a language for it. Because it's both. Yes, you have to exercise the muscle, and two, you're already okay, just as you are, if you wake up. Am I making myself more or less clear? Okay. So this is, again, quoting from the Anapanikattara, the heart of Buddhist meditation. I love this. Mindfulness is the unfailing master key for knowing the mind, and is thus the starting point. In other words, this is a good place to start. It's the perfect tool for shaping the mind, and is thus the focal point. The focal point means where we need to focus. And at the same time, it's the lofty manifestation of the achieved freedom of the mind, and is thus the culminating point. In other words, it's the beginning, the middle, and the end, all rolled into one. Again, I love that. Why? Because it's non-dual. It's not saying, well, you have to do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and you go through all these stages, and then finally you'll be who you want to be. No, you're already who you want to be. That's who you are. It's like, who even wants you to be? I mean, you're already who you are. Can you be that fully? Can you understand that fully? Okay, which brings us to this wonderful study by Zindel Siegel and Norman Farb, his postdoc, and a bunch of other wonderful people at the University of Toronto. And this is, even though Zindel Siegel is an MBCT person, this is an Mbsr study. And basically, I won't go through it in any detail, except to say that they were able to take people who were trained in Mbsr and show that if you just take people without any meditation training and you put them into a scanner and you say, don't do anything, just lie there. It turns out that a region of the brain called the medial, called the sort of midline structure in the frontal cortex, in the prefrontal cortex, lights up, uses up a lot of energy, gets very active. You're not doing anything, and some region gets very active. They were very interested in knowing what that, and it's now called the default mode network. Default mode. Default, you know what default means. It's like what your computer does. When it does what it does, it defaults to that state. And you can change the default mode on your computer, but you have to find out how to do that. So when we're not doing anything, lying in a scanner, all this brain activity is going on in this region, the medial cortex, in the middle. And it turns out that when we ask people what are they doing in there, they're generating narrative. They're generating the stories. Favorite story, of course, me. About the past, about the future, about where I'm going, about what I'm not going. So it's like, takes up a lot of energy. Now, when you train people in Mbsr, as this study shows, you see another area light up in the brain, and this one reduces. Okay, it doesn't go away, but it's reduced in intensity, and this one lights up a lateral network, and this is not a time sequence. The medial one is a story, so it's in time. This is not in time. This is more the body, breathing, sitting, knowing. It's just not, doesn't have a story. It's just this moment. It's more like a moment-by-moment experiential network that involves the insula and various regions on the lateral sides of the cortex. And so what they've noticed is that in this study and others is that they were able to uncouple these in people who had been through 8 weeks of Mbsr training. And now you have two things going on. You've got the story of me, but you also have the story of this moment, which is not a story. It's outside of time. It's just this experiential network. They call this the narrative network, and they're uncoupled. That means you have two different ways of being in relationship to life. And they talk about them as self-referential networks. And that gives you a lot more freedom to actually not be caught in the story of yourself. And gradually shift so that maybe this becomes the default mode network. Okay? So this has everything to do with, and you'll notice that this is the title of this paper, Attending to the Present, Mindfulness Meditation Reveals Distinct Neural Modes of Self-Reference. This is what psychology is all about, the self. Psychology is the study of the self. Now we're able to use these meditative practices and scanning technology, to actually look at what's going on when we pay attention in various ways and understand that maybe there are many different ways in which our self manifests. But if we get in the habit of only doing it in one tiny little way, then we're just reducing our own freedom of action, latitude in the world, and capacity for emotional intelligence and all sorts of different ways in which we're in relationship. So when we look at the self, well, just think for a moment. When you think about yourself, what do you think about? And are you your name? Are you your age? Are you your roles in life? Mother, father, your job, and all that? Those may define you to some degree, but are you more than that? So if you start to peel back that onion, you may finally come to a point where it's like hard to say. If you give up your name, give up your age, give up all the cultural stuff that's associated with it, who are you? That's a great question. And it's really wonderful if you don't try to answer it so much. Why not just live into not knowing exactly who you are, not having a big story in here. And of course, have you noticed you tell one story to one person, tell another story to another person, depending on how you want to look, the impression you want to make. So how many of you, just raise your hands, how many of you see a triangle in this figure here? Raise your hands if you see a triangle. Up high, I want to be able to feel them. Okay. Now just keep them up there as you realize that there is no triangle there. But your mind, your eyes, and your brain don't have any trouble in making a triangle. So you can put your hands down now. We see things that are not present. Okay? All the time. We see things that are not present. They're not true. They're illusions. Okay? The self might be like that. It's like, looks like a triangle. Everybody sees it as a triangle. But when you get right down to it, it's actually not. A triangle has to have lines. So that figure, the lines are supplied by the brain. The brain is so clever. It can actually see things that aren't there. It can actually miss things that are there too. You know the famous gorilla video? Okay, I can't show it anymore because everybody knows it, but you can have a whole movie going on of people passing basketballs around, and in the you show this movie to people. It takes a minute, and in the middle of the movie, somebody comes in from this side dressed in a black gorilla suit and walks into, the middle of these people passing basketballs around, turns like this to the camera, goes like this, and walks off, and 90% of people don't see the gorilla. Why? Because you've asked them before you start the movie to count the number of times the people in the black shirts, in the white shirts are passing the basketball. There are 3 people with white shirts, 3 people with black shirts. And the brain goes, oh, I know how to do that. Tune out everything that's black. So as soon as you tune something out, you don't see it. So we have these remarkable brains that both see things that are not present and don't see things that are present. So we need to kind of get more intimate with our minds so that we're not tricked all the time by our own story, by our own delusions, by our own attending to what we like, but not attending to what we don't like, and not even realizing that we're doing that. So if we realize that, then that's freedom. We have more options to navigate the ups and downs of our lives in ways that are profound and interconnected with each other. So it's not some isolated, meditator that doesn't care about anybody else. It's like completely interembedded in each other. So this is called the Lorentz strange attractor from chaos theory, and I'm just put it up there to say, well, maybe the self is more like this. It's a dynamical pattern that always looks more or less the same, but is never exactly the same. And this is a very well-known phenomenon in nonlinear dynamics, physics, chaos theory, and so forth. And on the next slide, here's a kind of dynamical motion of it. I just pulled this off the web. I'm not even sure that it's a real strange attractor because maybe it does repeat. But think about yourself, that you're always the same, but you're never the same. That's beautiful. So how about in this moment? Can you be spacious enough to not force yourself to be who you were the moment before? And of course, in your relationships, many people want you to be the person you were yesterday. But that doesn't leave you that much room for being new today or fresh today. Okay. So we get tons of training in thinking. Tons of training in thinking. How many of you went to school? Anybody go to school? What do they teach you in school? They teach you how to think, right? Discriminative thinking, analytical thinking, synthetic thinking, thinking. Now, how many of you have had the experience of trying to get into bed getting into bed at the end of a long day and then needing to sleep, really needing to sleep, and not like me being jet lagged because I just flew across the ocean, but just really needing to sleep, and your mind secretes one little thought. And then that little thought kind of secretes another little thought. And 3 hours later, you haven't gotten any sleep. Anybody have that experience? That the mind, so thinking can actually drive you crazy. And you can't shut it off. The more you try to shut it off, the more it's coming up. So you have to do Aikido with your thoughts, not karate. You can't punch them out. You have to dance with them. You have to befriend them. You have to, in some sense, get out of their way and not try to suppress them or force them to be a certain way, but just be bigger So if you really learn to inhabit awareness, your awareness can be so big that the thoughts stay small, and it's like being in an airplane at 30, 40,000 feet. You know, you can't even see the people, or the cars, or the thoughts. So it's like just that awareness can do that, and then, you know, you can just go from awareness straight into sleep. But we spent all this time in school learning how to think, but when do we ever get taught how to rest in awareness? Or even that it's possible to rest in awareness. Until very recently, with this mindfulness revolution going on in the United States in schools, there was no training in how to pay attention. Now, wait a minute here. What's school all about? What do teachers most want from their students? They want them to pay attention, right? Like to please pay attention, you know, or yell at them to pay attention. But what about teaching them to pay attention? What about teaching the students how to pay attention? What William James said, the mind wanders. You can bring it back. Mind wanders again, you can bring it back. Mind wanders, you don't want to bring it back, you bring it back anyway, against the resistance, with the resistance, and the muscle of attention, of concentration, of clarity, of insight begins to grow. Because as soon as you can really attend, then you can apprehend what the lesson is, what the teaching is, and its relationship to you, because the awareness holds all of that. So now teachers are teaching their students how to pay attention. Extraordinary. And they do it through very interesting little meditative exercises, including, I don't have the kind of bell they use, but I'll just ring this bell. And they have a big bowl that they hit with a stick, a gong, you know, and it's like, so it's a really loud sound. And the kids are all sitting up in their chairs like this. I've seen this in many schools, in many hard schools, difficult schools, in very bad neighborhoods, and where, you know, they have no resources, and, you know, a lot of violence at home and in the neighborhood, and the teacher will just ring this gong, and the kids will just be unbelievably quiet. And then gradually, if you're watching the class, over time, kids will raise their hands until everybody's got their hand up. Now, what are they doing? They're raising their hand when they can no longer hear the sound of the gong. Okay? So they're paying attention to not hearing through hearing. That's a very sophisticated exercise. You can do it with 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds. And they learn to be still and awake and not self-distracting. As a teacher, isn't that what you want? You want your kids to be able to actually pay attention so that they can take in what is being offered. So, I like to say that awareness, if we could balance out our thinking with awareness, then there's nothing wrong with thinking. Thinking is fantastic, it's wonderful, absolutely essential. But when it runs rampant with no awareness, then it gets really stressful, really problematic in many ways. And why is this important? Well, you could say that awareness, I like to say that awareness is the final common pathway of what makes us human. That's what really characterizes our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, if we can wake up to the name we've given ourselves. And our whole education system cultivates and refines critical thinking, but where is the education that cultivates and refines awareness itself? There's a balance. Well, it's starting to happen. And not just in elementary school and high school, but also in the universities. An enormous amount of creativity, bringing mindfulness and other contemplative practices into the university curriculum to enhance creativity, imagination, discipline, conversation, all sorts of things. Being in silence together is creative. It's generative. It stimulates good ideas, good thinking, outside the box thinking. And that has implications for education, for healthcare, for criminal justice, for economics, for politics, and government, and people are writing books about that. Like Jeffrey Sachs, who's a macroeconomist at Columbia University, wrote a book several years ago called The Price of Civilization. The whole second part of it's about mindfulness in all these different areas. It's revolutionary, and yet it's happening. And it's very profound, I would say. Now, from the beginning, Mbsr was conceived of as a public health initiative. It's said on the slide, it's not a therapy. We had very large classes, and the idea was to just keep offering Mbsr year after year after year after year after year, and gradually it would move the bell curve of the society, and that's exactly what it's done. So it's always been meant to be a public health intervention, to really transform how we are as a society and how we relate to health, and it involves, you know, a sense of participating in your own healthcare, like it's a participatory medicine. It's not just a auto mechanics fix-it model of medicine. And there are very few fixes and cures in medicine. The Four Noble Truths, interestingly enough, on the Buddhist side, are expressed in a medical terminology. The first noble truth is the diagnosis, I mentioned this before, of dukkha, stress, suffering, anguish, so forth. The etiology is the origin of dukkha. The origin of dukkha is said to be craving, attachment, and self-identification. Okay? That's the moment that we create suffering. When we clamp onto something, I have to have it this way, or I hate that, I can't have it that way. That's the moment that we create this kind of suffering. The prognosis, it's possible to be liberated from it. There's a very, very positive prognosis. Okay, there's liberation from this kind of suffering. It's called Adventitious Suffering. And the treatment is, in the Buddhist tradition, the Eightfold Noble Path. One of those path factors is mindfulness. They all integrate. Okay, so just to say, there's a lot of confluence here between the Dharma in its classical expression and how we're trying to teach it. And as I said, hospitals are dukkha magnets for suffering. What better place to offer a universal Dharma approach to the relief of suffering and investigate its clinical effectiveness? So that's what we've been doing. And as you know, it's now permeating out into large swaths of society. There is an attitudinal and ethical foundation. In the hospital, the ethical foundation is the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. Now, how can you possibly know if you're doing harm unless you're aware? You have to be aware of how you look at a person, or a kind of slight change in your intonation or language could actually cause harm. And there are examples of this in full catastrophe living. So there is a very strong ethical foundation to mindfulness, the way we teach it in Mbsr and MBCT. That's another place where we sometimes get criticized by Buddhist scholars. But just because it's implicit doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And it may be the most skillful way to actually bring it into the world is not to insist on it too much. But these are some of the factors, the attitudinal and ethical factors that are involved in the sort of foundation of mindfulness. And then there's informal practice, like when we teach it in Mbsr, everything is meditation. Going to sleep is meditation. Waking up is meditation. Making your child's lunch to go off to school is meditation. Everything is in some sense, you can bring awareness to everything. And so from that point of view, the real meditation practice isn't the body scan, it isn't sitting like this, it isn't doing yoga, it's how you live your life from moment to moment. Whatever circumstances you find yourself in, that's the real meditation practice. Is this easy? No, this is the hardest work in the world for us human beings. That's one of the things I love about doing it in the hospital, is that, you know, we're asking people to do very, very difficult things, and they are taking to it like ducks to water. Why? Because in the case of chronic pain patients and other people with medical problems, they've had all the medical treatments and they have not taken them where they need to be. So they're trying this. And it's really profound. I mean, it brings tears to my eyes just to experience it. I never get used to it. Never get used to it. How transformative and healing people can be, self-healing, when they align with what's deepest and best in themselves. And so this really is what we're seeing nowadays is a confluence of Dharma, deep Dharma expression, as I've been using the term, and science. Now the word Dharma, with a capital D, means the teachings of the Buddha. With a small d, it means a kind of universal way of being. They're the same. And you can see what's happening in the world, okay? So here I was, the last time I was in Copenhagen, there were 77 papers in 2005 that came out on mindfulness. In 2013, there were 549, okay? This is an exponentially growing curve. Will it grow like that forever? No, because nothing goes exponential forever. But we don't know how much further this will go and what happens when it levels off. Maybe people will get bored with mindfulness and go on to something else. But these are papers in the medical and scientific literature. This is astonishing. This is the first paper that came out of the stress reduction clinic in 1982 on chronic pain, on the outcome of our chronic pain patients. Now, my intention from the very beginning, I have to say, was for this to happen. You know, I wasn't trained to study human beings, and I'm trained to study bacteria. I'm a molecular biologist, okay? But nobody else was interested in this, so I figured I have to do this until the real scientists learn how to do it. And now there's a whole neuroscience of mindfulness, all sorts of cognitive scientists that are involved in this. Francisco Varela wrote a fantastic book in 1992 called The Embodied Mind, published by MIT Press. And, you know, it's very hard to understand, but it's worth understanding, bringing mindfulness and cognitive science together at the highest levels. And there are all sorts of things driving this curve. And some of them, you know, I'm not sure this is an entirely good thing. Yes, mindfulness is getting more and more popular, but also, yes, people don't even know that it's deep. They just think it's another superficial thing that they go and, as I said, take a weekend workshop, and then they're a mindfulness teacher. It's like, oh my God. But at the same time, there are all these wonderful trainings that are available for people who really want to bring this into their lives and into their work in ways that have integrity. And I'm hopeful, I'm very, very optimistic that in the end, it will all, you know, work out in the right way. The question is, do we have that much time? You know, if we need 1,000 years for it to work out so that all of this sort of inauthentic ways lose energy and dissipate, and the authentic ways keep going, we might not have 1,000 years, folks, you know, for what's going on the planet. So it's very important that everybody in this room, for instance, who understands this, who loves this, who cares about it, take responsibility for coming to this work with integrity in whatever ways you feel is your way to do it. And that way, I think, with a distributive function and all of us taking care of ourselves and the world and our hearts, that and not cutting corners, that it could actually be healing and transformative, not just for you yourself, not just for your family, but for the planet. And maybe even for Denmark, you know. I don't know enough about Denmark to know what Denmark's needs are. Okay, so I'm going to say a few things now about how popular it's getting, because these were studies in the medical literature, okay? Medical and scientific literature. So that's colossal. But now, you know, once you have a science of this, then the science of meditation in Time magazine, this was back in 2003, it becomes popular, and then people start to sort of think they understand it when they don't really understand it, because even what it says in the press is wrong a lot of the time. Here, the Mindful Revolution, you put an anorexic model on the cover. This one's, you know, why do they need white models all the time to show meditation? I mean, this person looks half dead, you know. But it's the cover story, and it's all about Mbsr. And a lot of it's not so great. They left out some of the most important things. But there's a certain way in which it's out there in the mainstream in a way that it hasn't been before. Saki and I were in China back in November, and we're about to lead a 7-day retreat for about 250 people or something like that here in Denmark. We did one a year ago in Rome, and I know some of you I met were there at that one. This was in Beijing in November, 300 people. And I have to remind them that what we're teaching them, that they're so excited to learn, is much more Chinese than it is American. I mean, they have the thousands of year history of meditation practice, not us, of Chan, of like extraordinary expressions of human wisdom at its absolute quintessence. They don't know very much about it. And they wouldn't be at all interested if it weren't for the neuroscience and the clinical medicine, you know, and they're very interested. And half the people in this photograph are probably 25 years old. And they're not just from Beijing, they're from all over China, every province in China. So just the reason I do this is, imagine, you know, China is now, and for probably the next several hundred years, going to be what we call in the United States the 800-pound gorilla on the planet. Okay? They're in a class by themselves because of their economic clout. Imagine if the Chinese could get back in touch with their wisdom dimension and integrate that into their economics, into their politics, into their global thing, so that they're not doing what they're doing in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, you know, claiming all the, you know, the sort of territory for themselves and getting into sort of these adversarial situations with other countries. Very dangerous ones, by the way. So, you know, I'm not saying I believe any of this, because it's, you know, it's very hard to change the world. But I love this picture because it's like, you know, here it is, path of mindfulness, flowers in full bloom. You know, it's like, they are very enthusiastic about this. And so we'll see what happens over time. This is the Parliament in London. There are over 70 members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons who have been through an 8-week mindfulness-based training program. And a long waiting list. This is like the government of the United Kingdom, folks. And they are lining up to train in mindfulness. I can't imagine that that's a bad thing. I mean, I think we need all the mindfulness and heartfulness we can get from our government officials, whether it's in US or UK or Denmark. And this is a photograph of, you know, some of the principals. This is Chris Cullen, who leads the programs there. And, he is also the developer with another teacher. He's a teacher, a high school teacher. He's the developer of a very imaginative program in the schools called, in the UK, called .b, for stop, breathe is what it stands for, but it's just .b, like .com, letter B. Mindfulness in schools, if you're interested in this, you can Google mindfulness in schools, and you'll get this amazing curriculum. If you make a mistake and Google mindful schools instead of mindfulness in schools, you'll get other amazing programs that are happening in Oakland, California, and are also training teachers in mindfulness. This is Lord Richard Layard, who is a world-class macroeconomist, who is very much into mindfulness and wrote a book on happiness and is working with the government to develop new metrics beyond gross domestic product to measure the true health of a society in the UK. This is like, you know, revolutionary stuff as far as I'm concerned. And this is a fellow who, from Wales, a member of Parliament, Chris Ruane, and he was also a school teacher. He's now a member of Parliament, and he's a big exponent of mindfulness in medicine, in the schools, in government, and has been really at the forefront of this whole movement. This is happening right across the water. And also in the Swedish Parliament, there's a fellow named Gunnar Miklak, who is actually training parliamentarians in the Swedish parliament. This is a poster from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health in the United States, from 10 years ago. This is 2004. And we had a day-long symposium at the National Institutes of Health on mindfulness, meditation, and health in 2004. The idea that that would happen in 1979 when I set up the stress reduction clinic, about as likely as that the Big Bang that started the universe expanding would all of a sudden come to a screeching halt and would collapse in on itself. That's how likely it was that the NIH would be interested in mindfulness. Now they're funding hundreds of millions of dollars of mindfulness research. But in order for that research to be valuable, the mindfulness has to really be mindfulness. The people who are doing the research and the people who are leading the clinical programs have to actually be grounded in this deep understanding of it. Otherwise, it's just garbage in, garbage out, as they say. And here is a conference from the Mind and Life Institute, which you probably know holds conferences periodically between scientists and the Dalai Lama. And this one is on the science and clinical applications of meditation. It took place in Washington, D.C. in 2005. And this is the book that came out of that conference that some of you might be interested in taking a look at. But it's just like a real evidence, and a lot of it, of the depth at which people are bringing to this conversation of Dharma and science, talking to each other and feeding each other. It's not just all one way. The Dharma is actually changing as the science influences it, and the science is changing as the Dharma influences it. Are you doing okay, by the way, or am I just boring you to tears at this point? It's been a long time sitting. You okay for a little bit longer? 15 minutes. Okay, so just as in a meditation practice, let's actually stop for a moment and now have this be a new beginning, okay? The talk, this is a new beginning, okay? It's like you haven't been sitting here for 2 hours or whatever it is. It's like fresh, okay? So like refreshing your computer, refresh yourself, you know? Not by going anywhere, but just, yeah, you can stand up if you want to. But I'm talking more about like an attitudinal shift. Okay, so, and this is a book that Mark Williams and I, neither of whom, by the way, just, you know, for the sake of full disclosure, I am not a Buddhist. Mark Williams is not a Buddhist. I mean, we're both very serious students of Buddhist meditation, but we're not Buddhists. But we got invited to be the guest editors of a Buddhist journal called Contemporary Buddhism, a special issue on mindfulness. So we invited a whole bunch of people, Buddhist scholars and so forth, to write about it from different perspectives. And then we put this all together in, you know, in an issue of the journal. The issue of the journal was so popular, it sold out immediately, and the publisher actually put it out as a book. And I recommend this book if you're serious about this work, because there are a lot of different scholars and scientists and clinicians who are writing very serious papers about the development of this whole field, what the promise of it is, and also what the problems with it are, and the dangers, and how we need to be on the lookout for them. There's also this Mindfulness Research Monthly, which you can join for free on the web, and it every month will send you everything that's being done in the field of mindfulness and the scientific papers, and it sorts them for you. And then there's this journal, Mindfulness, which is also available, and increasingly is getting, you know, better and better studies. And then one of our Congress people, Tim Ryan, who is only 38 years old, or maybe he's 40 years old now. He's he's been in Congress for 12 years at this point, and he wrote a book called A Mindful Nation, where he's talking about all sorts of different applications of mindfulness in the world, and then advocating for it in government. Now, if you know anything about the United States Congress, he's one person out of 435 Congress people. So we have 434 more to go, and then 100 senators as well. So it's a long, arduous undertaking, but that's certainly a step in the right direction. So I'm going to just say a few more things about the science, and then we'll stop. Okay? So I did say that the hippocampus is sensitive to stress, highly sensitive to stress, and that it influences, it has the potential to influence, depression, PTSD, Alzheimer's, and so forth. But the hippocampus, because of neuroplasticity, also has the ability to remodel synapses and generate new neurons. Up until you die, by the way. So it has a possible role in mediating benefits of mindfulness training in terms of emotion regulation and learning and memory. And here is a study from the Britta Herzl, who was a postdoc in Sarah Lazar's lab at Harvard University Medical School and the Mass General Hospital. How many of you are familiar with this work? How many of you are familiar with this work? Wow, okay. I thought everybody would be familiar with it. This comes out of Mass General Hospital and Harvard University. They used our patients from UMass, the stress reduction clinic at UMass, and they're showing that in 8 weeks of Mbsr training, the left side of the hippocampus increases in gray matter density. That means it gets thicker. Okay, that's a structural brain change, not an activity change. This is very interesting. Other regions of the brain, like the posterior cingulate, which is the posterior cingulate cortex, is a very big and active center and is involved in processing of self-relevant stimuli. And one of our colleagues, Judd Brewer, who's the director of research, newly appointed director of research at the Center for Mindfulness, he's showing real-time neural feedback to the posterior cingulate cortex and the PCC, and showing that if you are actually in the scanner, you can regulate the activity of the posterior cingulate cortex and learn by practicing to drop into states of remarkable stillness where there's no sort of excitation whatsoever. And so that regulates, self-relevant stimuli. The temporal parietal junction also gets thicker. Change in perspective and empathy is, one of the functions of this region. And even the cerebellum, which is usually just thought of as for motor coordination, gross motor coordination, plays a role in emotion regulation. It also gets thicker. This is in 8 weeks. Now there are scientific studies, and by the way, probably you saw that on your chairs, there's an announcement of Richard Davidson coming next year. Well, Richard Davidson, who's a long-term friend of mine and colleague, has been doing studies showing that even, 8 hours of meditation can actually make changes in the brain of this kind. Extraordinary what the brain can actually do when it undergoes training. And so these are, this is the posterior cingulate, this is the temporal parietal junction, this is another region, this is the cerebellum. And in all cases, you see Mbsr significantly thicker than the control group of people who are not trained in mindfulness. Okay, and then the amygdala, which is that threat reactivity center, that actually gets thinner with mindfulness training, and I said at the beginning of the talk, it gets thicker with stress. So this is actually demonstrating that the brain responds to training in mindfulness in just the directions that you'd want to maintain well-being, perspective taking under stress, emotion regulation, and so forth. And it's an example of how we're moving the bell curve in the direction of greater well-being, just what we wanted to do at the beginning. The brain research actually makes it much more compelling that people would be interested than just if they felt better. Feel better, who cares? But my brain's different, I want to do it. And this is also an example of a paper that just came out a few months ago in the Journal of the American Medical Association, looking at a meta-analysis of meditation programs for psychological stress and well-being. And it found only moderate changes, but moderate changes actually can make a big difference in a population over time. Not only that, part of the reason it found moderate changes is it mixed up a lot of different kinds of meditation practices without singling out, without having any way of determining which the best ones were, which was the best trainings, the best teaching, the best, most authentic. And when you do that, then of course you're not going to get anywhere near the kind of high resolution impact that you might get otherwise. This all is part of the reason why it takes 100 years or 1,000 years for the bell curve to actually shift fully to a place where we could actually say that we have created a much more mindful planet or a much more mindful society. It's an ongoing challenge, and there's a lot of work involved. So let's see if I'm just going to quickly go through some of this. Everybody laughs when they see this picture. This is our colleague Mathieu Ricard, who was a French monk. He was, like me, trained as a molecular biologist at the Pasteur Institute, went to Nepal, met all these Tibetans, decided to become a Tibetan monk instead of a successful molecular biologist. He's been a monk for 40 or 50 years. Spent many, many years as the attendant of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, one of the absolutely greatest teachers in the Tibetan lineage in this century. And this is just to say that when we wire people up this way for Mbsr, a study that we did with Richie Davidson more than 10 years ago, that we see shifts in activity from right activation to left activation, which is just what you see in Buddhist monks who've been meditating for many, many, many years. We see that in 8 weeks. And we also, when we give them a flu vaccine, we give them, we can measure the immune response to an influenza vaccine, that the meditators mount a much stronger immune response than the non-meditators. And when you plot the degree of brain shift versus the degree of antibody titer, you get a straight line in the meditators and you get no relationship whatsoever in the controls. So I'm going to, let's see. I mentioned, I'm going to just show you some pictures of the kids, okay? So these are kids in Utah, in a small town in Utah, 18 to 20 years ago. They had a teacher named Miss Hamrick, and she had taken Mbsr and decided to bring it into her classroom and teach it, integrate mindfulness into all the different areas of the curriculum. So here are the kids doing a body scan in their classroom. These kids are now in their late 20s and 30s, and we're doing a 20-year follow-up study of them. Mindful yoga. Mindful walking outside in the schoolyard. And then here are just some slides of, I worked with the US Olympic rowing team. I lost all my slides of the rowing team, so this is the East Germans who don't even exist. This is another slide of George Mumford, who I said worked with the Chicago Bulls in their heyday and then the Los Angeles Lakers. So, and we're even working with the military in very interesting ways and showing that, hopefully that as we train soldiers, they will actually do less harm, not do more harm. We're not training them to be better killers. It's very controversial, but we're actually training them to be much more aware of the consequences that they can have, especially when they lose their minds. And so we're studying with a Mishi Jha, working memory, for instance, which is the first thing that degrades in your prefrontal cortex when you get really stressed. And they're showing that if you meditate, if you practice mindfulness, pre-deployment, that your working memory does not degrade, even as the stress gets more and more. And if you don't practice it, that it does. So I'm going to just finish with a quote from William James, who said, famously, "I have no doubt whatever that most people live, whether physically, intellectually, or morally, in a very restricted circle of their potential being. They make use of a very small portion of their possible consciousness, much like a man who out of his whole bodily organism should get into a habit of using and moving only his little finger. We all have reservoirs of life to draw upon, these deep inner resources for learning, for growing, for healing, and for transformation that are innate to us. We all have reservoirs of life to draw upon of which we do not dream. So I want to thank you for your attention, welcome you to the end of the first session and the beginning of lunch and then the afternoon session. I myself really look forward to hearing from Lona and from Jakob and from Saki, and then maybe coming around at the end and entertaining some questions for you. So I want to thank you. It's been a very long talk. I hope it hasn't been too boring or repetitive, but let's just take a moment before we end and just drop in for just a moment to silence. And just letting everything that's been said or heard just wash through. We don't have to cling to any of it or pursue any of it, but to just stay in a sense of awareness of the body, sitting here breathing. And awareness of the community of all 900 of us together is just an enormous potential power, I'll say, in our potential to work together in ways that really do cultivate wisdom and authenticity and kindness and compassion and mindfulness and heartfulness. My hope is that you will find ways to integrate this into what you most love in ways that will transform both yourself and the world. So, thank you. And enjoy your lunch. Remember, I said we could keep up, everything is part of the meditation practice. So lunch is just one more meditation, okay? Complicated because we'll be talking to each other, so all the more reason to be grounded in the body and really in touch. Thank you, folks. It's been an absolute pleasure.